Welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Tuesday, October 5th. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. Many of the stories read here can also be found at our website at IndianCountryNews.com, and here are some of the news stories for the day from the Associated Press and other Native news sources. A federal judge has rescinded an agreement that allowed the Confederated Salish and Courte tribes to assume most jobs and management duties of the National Bison Range. U.S. District Judge Colleen Kohler-Cotelli in Washington, D.C. ruled last week that a 2008 funding agreement violated federal law. She ruled the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service did not give an adequate reason for not assessing the possible environmental impacts of the agreement with the tribes over management of the range on the Flathead Reservation in western Montana. The National Bison Range was established in 1908 and is part of the National Wildlife Refuge System. It is home to about 500 bison. Supporters of a $3.4 billion government settlement with American Indians over a trust lawsuit will have to keep waiting. The U.S. Senate adjourned without giving the Obama administration the authority to settle a class action lawsuit filed in 1996 by Eloise Cobell of Browning, Montana. The suit accuses the federal government of mismanaging billions of dollars held in trust for Indian landowners and tribes. The Senate will reconvene for a lame duck session November 15th. Cobell says no decision has been made on whether to press for Senate approval during that session. The House has approved the settlement twice since May. Cobell says the Senate's inaction is a great disappointment. And today we talk with Shoshone Bannock tribal member Mark Trahant and his occasional observation of things like health care and politics. And today we talk about federal budgets and the future of economics, where we might just be stuck with a lot of what we have right now and the potential of more budget cuts and more budget cuts after that.
Mark Trahant, how is Shoshone country treating you nowadays? You're newly arrived back home.
We are. We have a foundation, and we're waiting for the. We bought a modular house. We're waiting for a crane to put it on, and then all the permitting, and it's been great fun. But we're looking forward to it.
Is it easier to get blocks of commodity cheese when you're in the neighborhood? Or?
Well, we're more interested in our garden right now than commodity cheese. So
okay. You've been studying the budget for a long time from a lot of perspectives, healthcare in particular, but now you're looking at budget issues in a more broader sense. Give me a little idea about what you see, and again, it's all related to what I call the squeeze on available monies for programs. Give me a little bit of an overview of what you're seeing there at the federal level.
Well, I set out to write about this in the broadest context because I want tribes to be prepared. And in order to be prepared, you have to kind of see what's coming. If you look at just one category of the budget, it's called net interest. And that's the amount of money the federal government pays to primarily Chinese, Canadian, UK, many Americans who buy treasury bonds. And that's the amount of money that's paid every year to service the growing national debt. Well, that number is going from about 4% of the budget to 16% of the budget in the next 10 years because our debt is so large. And that's going to crowd out all kinds of social programs, and especially the little slice that makes up the Indian Health Service and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That pressure will be great. People have this conception of the budget that you can cut out fraud and waste, and that's somehow going to make things healthy. But the fact is that 2/3 of the budget is really off limits. 2/3 of the budget is things like Medicare and Medicaid that's all on automatic pilot. You get down to domestic social programs, which is like the BIA and IHS, and you're talking about less than 4% of the pie. It's a really small percentage.
Medicare, Medicaid, is Social Security in that major pie, and you're saying it's eating up how much? What is the percentage? 80% of the budget? More than 80% of the budget?
Well, no. Medicare, Medicaid, and CHIP are 21% of the budget. Just that. And then on top of that, now Social Security's off budget, so it's a different set of books. In theory, at least now, Social Security actually saves some money. So it's ahead of spending, although that's changing rapidly. The problem with Social Security down the road is that Social Security has been passing the government what's called government debt, and sooner or later that debt is going to have to be repaid in order to keep paying Social Security benefits, and that will be another column down the road, but it will be a big budget pressure item.
When you're looking at this increasing debt interest, how fast is that going to occur? Are you talking about the next budgeting period? Are you talking in 4, 6, 8 years? What kind of a time frame are you looking at?
A decade, the next 10 years.
The next 10 years.
It starts to creep up this year. It actually goes up 2% this year. So you'll see that increase starting.
And so what is your recommendation? What are you trying to tell Indian country? You're trying to tell Indian country that no matter what kind of battles are coming up, there's just going to be less money at some point. Be prepared for that?
Be prepared for that. Conserve resources, conserve cash. Look for programs that don't have ongoing infrastructure costs that you're going to have to pick up. Probably the biggest in that regard that I'm really concerned about is law and order. As the federal government gets more and more pressure, this new Law and Order Act is going to be very expensive. One way to mitigate for that would be to spend as much money as possible on upfront programs. Domestic violence counseling, for example, is a lot less expensive than incarceration. And so try to focus on what's going to save money both in the short and the long term.
Same philosophy on healthcare, preventative medicine, trying to keep people out of hospitals.
Oh, absolutely. If we could get, let's just take one, the most expensive disease both in America and in Indian country is diabetes. And if you can get the community engaged in walking, exercise, maybe sharing diet information, things like that in a collective sense, that could reduce your costs in what you actually spend out in drugs and pharmaceutical expenses.
Do you find many tribes operating off of investment equity, mutual funds and stuff like that? It seems my impression is most tribes are still operating totally off their cash flow. So they're eating up cash and not putting it aside. For example, they haven't created an endowment to take care of their educational facilities, and so they're operating off of cash rather than operating off the interest of some kind of a trust fund or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, one of the things I suggested with Indian Health, but I think it has much broader applications, is creating community foundations that actually raise money that can do things tribal governments can't do in terms of grants and operations. And that would be strictly an endowment where the money would operate. This is, though, I have to say, this is a really strange time for endowments because the Treasury basically has zero interest rates, and that's the safest return you have. And you just don't have a lot of income power from endowments right now.
Right. Is that off of bonds or what?
Right.
You know, what kind of?
Right. And we're in such a low interest.
Yeah.
It's such a low interest rate environment, and I still would, if it were up to me, be buying Treasury bonds and things even at those low rates, because in an era of deflation, cash is the most important asset you can have, and Treasury bonds are essentially cash.
And so that's your advice to tribal governments. What about the tribal members? You know, that less income, less experience with any of this, like retirement funds and pensions and mutual funds like that. What kind of simple advice do you have for people?
Well, right now it's more important than ever for people to try to live below their means and to try to cushion themselves with savings. I think it's very realistic that many, particularly mid-level government jobs, both in tribal government and in federal government, will see pay cuts in the coming decade. And that's not something our generation has experienced before. We're used to always making more than we did the year before. I got a hard lesson in that thanks to the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. And fortunately, I had savings and I had some of the things that made that transition doable. But for a lot of people, if you're living on the edge, and a lot of people in our communities are, it's going to be a very difficult transition.
Well, let me see if this area doesn't address that. Housing. You've moved back to the Shoshone Bannock reservation there, and you have the capability of building your own foundation and put your modular house out there. What is the availability of housing there on other reservation? I'm hearing with the return of many people to the reservations from the cities, truck drivers get laid off, can't pay their mortgage. They're moving back home where they can go out and perhaps rice or take a deer once in a while to feed the family. But I'm hearing that there's people living in tents in the woods and in basements. You got 2-3 families living in houses, basements, garages, and overflow tents, and winter's coming on. Are you seeing anything like that in terms of housing capabilities?
I'm not seeing that, but I am seeing a very tight market on the reservation. We looked. If we had chosen to go off, the availability was incredible because of foreclosures. I mean, you see in the neighboring towns, you just drive through towns and there's signs everywhere. Whereas on the reservation, the turnover remains low. People tend to stick in their houses for good, and that's probably a good thing, but there needs to be some availability. We really focused on, when we moved home, on figuring out what we could afford in this new environment and being frugal. And I think that's probably helped as well, that we knew what we were working with and just didn't go beyond that at all.
Okay, well, we'll talk a little bit more about that. I just had a thought, because it's like out in the Dakotas, every year we get these pleas from Pine Ridge and Rosebud and other places where people have run out of fuel, send donations and yet what the image I have in my mind is a Mandan house built down into the earth. Only the roof part is out of the earth. Everything else is down, either heated and cooled by this. It's like almost like some of the traditional housing we had. We need to get back to some of it because it made perfect sense. We've got to somehow adapt to that reality of the fact that out in South Dakota they have cold winters.
I think we can learn a lot from that. Absolutely. I kind of wanted to experiment with new tech when some of these building techniques, but my family wanted a house sooner rather than later. They figured if I got into that, it would take forever.
Yeah. Dig your own Mandan house, right? So you're out there with a shovel. Well,
I was thinking straw, but
well, it's definitely another way. There's people that are making that. I know at Pine Ridge they were talking about trying to use hemp fiber to do the same thing, and they weren't able to accomplish that. But the bottom line on budgets is be frugal, save money, and anticipate budget cuts in the future. That sounds like
that's right. Saying? We grew up, almost all of us, unless you're very old, in an era when things always got more the next year. Inflation went up 2-3%. Things cost more. You got a little more extra pay if you were particularly in a government job. Your houses got bigger. I mean, kind of the whole gamut. Even you look at FHA houses, even they got bigger. We're turned the corner. This is what economists are calling the new normal, where we're for the next 5, 10, 15 years going to be smaller. And that's going to be in pretty much every regard. And those that plan for that will come through it a lot better.
Always good talking to you, Mark. We'll touch base with you again in a week or so.
Take care.
And that is the latest roundup of news from Indian Country. On this edition of the Native News Update, we want to say miigwech for showing up. Come back again soon.